Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The city of Noxus had not seen sunlight in over a century. Beneath the thick shroud of the eternal night, the inhabitants eked out a life in the dim glow of flickering street lamps and feeble fire. The blackened sky blanketed in clouds too thick to pierce gave an almost suffocating feel to the air, thick and stagnant. People moved like shadows slipping from one corner to another, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. The dark had long since stolen their hope, leaving behind only survival. Eric crouched by a crumbling wall, his breath shallow, watching as a group of dark wraiths slithered through the street ahead. His pulse quickened. The wraiths' beings formed entirely of the shadows that dominated Noxus seemed to glide without sound, searching for something, always hunting. He had encountered them before. They were relentless, tearing through anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. His grip tightened on the staff in his hand, the dark wood etched with symbols that glowed faintly with a dull, sickly green. He hated this staff, hated the magic it represented, but it was all he had. For years, Eric had lived as a dark mage, struggling to control the powers inherited from his ancestors. They had all succumbed to the darkness, lured in by the promise of power, and Eric feared that fate. His family line was cursed, tainted by the very forces that had turned Noxus into the city of endless night. Suddenly a wraith turned in his direction, its empty eyes blacker than the void surrounding them locked onto Eric. A cold dread flooded his veins as the creature hissed, its shadowy form rippling and expanding. Eric prepared for the inevitable confrontation, ready to summon the dark magic he despised. But something inside him flared, something unfamiliar, instead of the dark energy he had called upon so many times. Before, a pulse of warmth surged through him. Without thinking, Eric raised his hand and a burst of brilliant light shot forth from his palm. The light was pure, blinding, and it tore through the wraith like a knife through mist. The creature shrieked, its form disintegrating into nothingness, leaving the alley silent once more. Eric stared at his hand, stunned. Light. He had summoned light. His heart pounded in his chest, confusion and fear warring within him. This was impossible. He was a dark mage. There was no room for light in it. Before he could process what had just happened, a figure stepped out from the shadow. A woman, tall and lean, with short, dark hair and a gleaming sword strapped to her back. Her leather armor was worn but functional, the mark of someone who had seen more than her share of battle. "You are not like the others," he said, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. You can control the light." Eric tensed instinctively, raising his staff. "Who are you?" The woman held up her hands, a gesture of peace. "I've been hunting those things for years, but I've never seen anyone destroy one like that, not with light." "Sorry, Eric," and your mind raced. "Kinda know what you were talking about." Selena's eyes narrowed. "You might not, but you need to figure it out. This city, this eternal night, it's not natural, and if you can summon light, you might be the key to ending it." Eric took a step back. His thoughts jumbled. He had spent his whole life hiding, trying to avoid the fate of his family, trying to keep the darkness at bay. Now this woman was telling him he might hold the power to end the curse that had destroyed Noxus. It was too much. "I can tell you, hey," he said, turning away. "I don't even know what this is. It's a mistake." But Selena didn't back down. "It's no mistake, Krell," she said, her voice firm. "This city is dying, Eric, and whatever you just did, it's our only chance." Eric froze. How did she know his name? He turned back to her, eyes narrowing. How do you know who I am?" Selena hesitated, then sighed. "Sorry, I've heard stories. There aren't many dark mages left in Noxus, and your family's name is still known. But this," she gestures to the fading light in the air, sire, "this changes everything. We need you." Eric clenched his fists, his mind a storm of confusion and fear. He had spent his life running from darkness, trying to control it. The idea that he could control something as pure as light seemed laughable, and yet the proof was right in front of him. Selena took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his heart. "I am not asking you to save the world, Tyrite," she said quietly. "But I'm asking you to help me, because if we don't, you do something, this city will be swallowed whole." Mariko looked at her, seeing the desperation in her eyes. She wasn't just some soldier or warrior. She had lost something, just like him, and despite every instinct telling him to walk away, he found himself nodding. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The underground lair where Toby lived was a stark contrast to the city above. While Noxus lay crumbling, covered in dust and decay, Toby's workshop was alive with the hum of machinery and the clinking of metal. The young mechanic was hunched over a table, welding some intricate piece of technology when Eric and Selena arrived. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burning metal and oil that Toby didn't seem to mind. He was immersed in his work. "Tobida," called out, her voice cutting through the noise. Toby looked up, his goggles still covering his eyes. He pushed them up onto his forehead, revealing a face smudged with grease and a lopsided grin. "Erica said, introducing the mage. You were he's gonna help us." Toby raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Help us with what?" "Ending the eternal night," Eric said, flatly. The mechanic blinked, then laughed. "Right? And after that, we'll fix the weather and make the rivers flow backward." Selena shot him a look. "I am serious, Toby. Eric can control lights." Toby's grin faded as he studied Eric more closely. "Tar and control light, huh?" Steve reached out, grabbing a small device from his table. It was a crude, hand-sized contraption with wires sticking out at odd angles. "Let's test it." Then, before Eric could ask what Toby meant, the mechanic flicked a switch on the device. A beam of shadow shot out from the end, aimed directly at Eric's chest. Instinctively, Eric raised his hand and the light surged from him again, blasting the shadow away in an instant. Toby's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned." Selena crossed her arms. "Told you." Toby set the device down and wiped his hands on a rag. "All right, I am in. What's the plan?" Selena laid it out. There was a legend, an ancient relic called the Heart of Dawn, hidden somewhere in the ruins of Old Noxus. It was said to be a powerful artifact, one that could break the curse of the eternal night, but no one had seen it in centuries, and the ruins were crawling with dark forces. Eric listened, his stomach churning. He didn't want any part of this, but something inside him, a flicker of hope, or maybe just desperation, kept him from walking away. "So if we're going into the ruins," Toby asked, excitement creeping into his voice. "As that place is a death trap." Selena nodded. Eric glanced at the mechanic. "You don't seem too worried about that." Toby grinned. "Worried? Hell, no, this is what I live for. Besides, if you can blow away shadows like that, I think we've got a fighting chance." The mage wasn't too sure, but they were already in too deep to back out now. The ruins of Old Noxus loomed before them, crumbling towers and broken streets stretching out like the bones of a long dead beast. The air here was even thicker, the shadows darker, almost tangible. Eric could feel them pressing in on him, whispering in the back of his mind. As they made their way through the twisted alleys and shattered buildings, Eric's sense of unease grew. Something was watching them. He could feel it. "We're close," Selena whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the empty streets. "Afraid the entrance to the catacombs should be just ahead." Eric nodded, his hand hovering near his staff. He had been keeping the light magic in check, unsure of how to wield it properly. The few times he had used it, it had felt unstable, but he knew he would need it soon. Suddenly, a growl echoed through the ruins, low and menacing. Selena drew her sword. The steel gleaming in the dim light, Toby reached for one of his devices, a small bomb designed to release a blinding flash. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as a massive creature emerged from the shadows. It was a wraith larger than any he had seen before, its form shifting and pulsing with dark energy. Erica said, her voice tense. "Now would be a good time for some light." Eric swallowed hard, raising his hand. The light flickered to life, but it was weaker this time, sputtering like a dying flame. The wraith lunged. Eric's heart raced as the wraith hurtled toward him, its black tendrils flaring outward like claws ready to tear him apart. His pulse thrummed in his ears, drowning out Selena's shout. He focused on the flicker of light in his hand, trying to summon more of it, but the glow sputtered weakly. The wraith was nearly upon them when Selena threw herself in front of Eric, her sword slicing through the air. The blade met the creature's shadowy form with a dull thud, but the wraith recoiled, a high-pitched shriek ripping through the stillness. Eric saw the creature hesitate, its tendrils retreating momentarily as though it feared the steel in Selena's hand. Toby, crouched behind a broken column, hurled his flash bomb. The device hit the ground and exploded in a burst of white light, flooding the area with brightness that seemed to peel away the darkness. The wraith screamed again, its form unraveling in the brilliance, twisting and shrinking before it dissipated entirely. Eric blinked, dazed by the sudden rush of light. His breathing was ragged, and he felt the surge of energy inside him dim once again. His control over the light magic was slipping, and he didn't know how to fix it. "You all right?" Selena asked, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She was already wiping the black ichor from her blade. Eric nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he was fine. "I couldn't get the light to hold," he muttered, frustrated with himself. Toby approached, grinning despite the danger. "Don't you worry about it. We got there, didn't we? Besides, we were close. Now just ahead." Eric shook his head, but Toby was already gesturing toward a large stone archway. The entrance to the catacombs. They had made it this far, but a sinking feeling gnawed at Eric's gut. The worst was yet to come. The catacombs stretched deep beneath Noxus, their walls lined with ancient carvings that told stories of a time long before the eternal night had descended. The flickering light of their torches cast eerie shadows across the inscriptions, but Eric kept his eyes forward, focusing on what lay ahead. The air grew colder as they descended, and the oppressive weight of darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. Eric's grip tightened on his staff, the only thing anchoring him to his magic, however unreliable it felt. He could sense the dark forces gathering, the very walls around them humming with an energy that made his skin crawl. Selena stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to silence the group. They stood at the edge of a vast underground chamber, its ceiling soaring high above them and disappearing into the gloom. In the center of the chamber was a massive stone dais, and atop it, pulsing faintly, was the relic. They sought the heart of dawn. The artifact glowed with a soft, golden light barely strong enough to pierce the thick darkness surrounding it. Eric could feel its power, subtle but immense, like the steady pulse of something ancient and alive. "That Senate," Toby whispered, awe in his voice. "The heart of dawn." Eric's eyes were drawn to the relic, but his instincts told him to be cautious. The air in the chamber felt wrong, thick with malice. Something was waiting for them. As if in answer to his thoughts, the shadows at the far end of the chamber began to stir. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and imposing, cloaked in shadow, the Dark Mage Lord. Eric's stomach turned as the figure stepped into the dim light. The Dark Mage Lord was nothing like the wraiths they had encountered. He was far more human in appearance, but his presence was infinitely more terrifying. His eyes glowed with a sickly green hue, and the shadows seemed to coil around him, like living things whispering and writhing at his command. "You've come far?" the Dark Mage Lord said, his voice low and menacing, reverberating through the chamber. "But it ends here." Eric swallowed hard. This was the enemy they had feared, the one who thrived in the eternal night, the one who had cursed Noxus to this endless darkness. And now, standing before him, Eric felt the weight of his own inadequacy. The light magic inside him was weak, flickering at best. How could he hope to fight someone like this? But Selena stepped forward, her sword gleaming in the faint light of the heart of dawn. "We won't let you keep this city in darkness," she said, her voice firm. "The heart will end your reign." The Dark Mage Lord's laughter echoed off the walls, a deep, hollow sound. "You think a relic of the past will save you? You think light will banish me?" He spread his arms wide, and the shadows in the room seemed to swell, twisting and contorting into monstrous shapes. "I am the darkness. I am the eternal night." Eric felt the cold press of fear in his chest, but something inside him stirred. The light magic, it was still there, buried deep, waiting. He just had to find it. The Dark Mage Lord moved toward them, and the shadows surged. Selena darted forward, her sword cutting through the air in a blur of steel. She fought the shadows with a ferocity Eric had never seen before, each strike landing with precision, forcing the dark tendrils back. But it wasn't enough. For every shadow she cut down, more took its place. Eric raised his hand, trying once again to summon the light. A faint glow flickered at his fingertips, but it quickly died out. Frustration boiled inside him. Why couldn't he control it? Why was it so fleeting? Toby, meanwhile, was scrambling to activate one of his devices, a crude contraption designed to emit a burst of artificial sunlight. He fumbled with the wires, sweat dripping down his face as he worked against the clock. "Erica," Selena shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need you." His fist around his staff, around his staff, around his staff. He could feel the light within him, but it was slippery, elusive. It was as though something was holding it back, keeping him from tapping into its full power. And then he remembered his family, the long line of dark mages who had succumbed to the darkness, who had let it consume them. They had been too focused on power, too focused on controlling the darkness instead of understanding it. Light wasn't about control. It wasn't about forcing it to do his will. It was about balance. Eric closed his eyes, letting go of his frustration, his fear. He breathed deeply, centering himself, and felt the light stirring within him again, stronger this time. He didn't try to force it. He simply let it rise like a tide swelling beneath the surface. When he opened his eyes, the chamber was bathed in light, pure, radiant light. The shadows recoiled, hissing, and writhing as they were burned away by the brilliance. The Dark Mage Lord staggered back, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. You cannot, he roared, raising his hands to summon more shadow. But the light surged again, brighter than before, and the shadows melted away like mist in the morning sun. Selena, emboldened by the sudden turn, charged forward. Her blade found its mark, cutting through the Dark Mage Lord's defenses. He howled in pain, stumbling back as the light continued to drive him toward the decase, where the heart of dawn pulsed with growing intensity. Ares stepped forward, the light surrounding him, now steady and strong. He could feel its power coursing through him, not just light, but the balance between light and dark. The two forces weren't enemies. They were two sides of the same coin. You can defeat me, the Dark Mage Lord hissed, his voice trembling with rage and desperation. I'm eternal. Eric met his gaze, unflinching. Nothing is eternal. With one final surge of light, Eric unleashed the full force of his magic. The Dark Mage Lord screamed as the light tore through him, ripping the shadows from his body and leaving nothing but an empty husk. The darkness in the chamber evaporated, replaced by the warm glow of the heart of dawn. The battle was over. Eric stood there breathing heavily, his hand still glowing with the remnants of the light. Selena approached, her sword lowered, her eyes wide with awe. You did it, she said softly. Eric nodded, though he wasn't sure how he had done it. The power of the light still hummed within him, but it felt different now, calmer, more in harmony with the darkness he had always feared. Toby, ever the optimist, leapt out a whoop of victory. We did it, he cheered, clapping Eric on the back. That was incredible. Together the three of them turned toward the heart of dawn, which now glowed with a steady, brilliant light. The curse of the eternal night had been broken. As they emerged from the catacombs, the first rays of sunlight pierced the sky, bathing the ruins of Noxus in warmth and light. For the first time in a century, the city was no longer shrouded in darkness. Eric, Selena, and Toby stood on a hill overlooking the city as the dawn broke over the horizon, knowing that while the battle had been won, the journey to rebuild Noxus was only just beginning.